Hi, friend. Welcome back to the Mindset Check podcast. I'm your host, Misha McKittrick. This is a podcast where we believe that as you take time for a mindset check, you have more power than you think you do. And where we also believe when we widen our perspective and try to understand other people's points of view, it gives us incredible power to both see the world with a more expansive view, but it limits our own internal suffering, and it does really cool and amazing things to our brain. That's what we're going to get into today. I'm really glad that you're here with us. Just so that you know, before we really just jump in season 1, we went through my journal of when I was 15 and pregnant, and we went through some really rocky times and some really, interesting things about life. And the best thing about the whole aim of this entire podcast is, yes, we're walking through a story, but we're really diving into life. We're really diving in to try to understand that as we go through what appears to be, I want to say a normal story. It is a little bit of an extreme story, but it represents normal life. The things that we learn, the things that we adapt to, the things that we go through, right? That we're trying to process and we're trying to make sense of. And taking time to absorb stories and experiences of other people and the way that we take them apart helps us to learn and grow as human beings, and it helps us to be better. So in that first season, we really go through my side of the story. And in this second season, we're going through the side of the story from my current husband's point of view and what was kind of going on for him and how we ended up coming together. So it's kind of a fun, different mix on season 2. And like I always say, you're more than welcome to just join us today or to go back and listen to the story. We're happy to have you either way. As far as today's story goes, essentially it's Jake and my ex-husband Jesse, and we mentioned Cassie, who is Jake's older sister. We talk about Chase just a little bit, and I just want you to know, preeminently that everything that's mentioned with Chase in this episode is what we will dive into more next week. So if you're like, wait, what happened with Chase? Just know that yes, we will be diving into that so much more. And that is essentially why we're not talking about it in this episode. It's just enough for you to understand the gravity of what is actually happening. And then outside of that, I think everything should be pretty self-explanatory. Let's jump in.
Reflections, late February, 1996. Sitting here with more mixed and opposite emotions than I ever thought possible for a senior in high school, and in such a short span of a few months. It's been one thing for Misha to break up with me in mid-January, suddenly losing the best thing to ever happen to me. But to lose Chase soon after, so tragically, on the night of the 22nd, it felt more than this young 18-year-old heart could bear. In these recent weeks, I've never been so broken, yet so much love and miracles have healed me. I've never experienced such sorrow and sadness, yet enough moments of joy and comfort give me hope. I've never felt so defeated, yet occasional glimpses of determination to press forward. As for this very moment, it's still hurt and confusion over Misha as I stare at these few items in front of me. A stack of 3 green napkins from the dance, saved in my sports coat, that say, Winter Wonderland, Senior Cotillion, December 16th, 1995. A note that says, Jake, hello, I'm going to St. George with my dad at 4. I will be at April's game. Try to stop by, Kay. Love, Misha. A stack of Lynn's receipts with Misha's printed name on them from stopping by to see her on November 27th, December 23rd, December 31st, January 4th, January 5th, January 6th, January 11th, January 15th. I wish I would have saved the others. A small floral card from January 23rd that says, Jake, I wish I had the magic words for you. Please let me know if I can do anything at all. I promise I will be here to listen and talk whenever you need it. Just call. Love, Misha. Well, here's what I wish I could tell her. Yes, there is something you can do. I want to be sitting next to you. I want to still see our names dangling from the rearview mirror of your new Galant. I want to continue stopping by Lynn's to take your 15 to 20 minute break with you, and sometimes meeting at Leah's after to hang out, laugh, and find whatever minutes we can together. I want things to continue how they were, to see you light up when you see me, to feel so amazing just being with you. It's hard to hear about how you apparently already like me so much that it's too scary to keep seeing each other. It's hard to hear you already say that I'm everything you would want in a future husband, yet we'll go ahead and limit our interactions for now. That you'd like to still occasionally get together, stay in touch, and maybe date some more just before I leave in the fall, but when I'm home 2 years later, we can be more serious. I don't want to feel like starting to date Sarah now is just some rebound move because of missing what you and I had, and me looking for the next best thing to replace that or fill a void. I don't like the awkwardness of having to disclaim to her that you and I still sort of have this connection we've paused, that we will still be seeing each other every so often for breakfast or lunch or whatever may come up. Please help me see how any of this makes sense. Please help me understand how you can like me enough to say such incredible things, but not want to be with me until a future time. Maybe you think saying these things will help, or will soften the blow. It doesn't. In a way, it only makes it worse. I guess I'll count myself lucky that you seem to suggest this is just a temporary sort of break, but I hate that it feels like a game, and to have my mom and sisters telling me this too. I love that you brought me flowers the night after Chase died, at a time when I couldn't possibly feel more low. Just seeing you again, to go for a drive, to park and chat, to feel how much you still care. This was probably the best thing I could have asked for. The flowers were great, but what I really want now is for you to bring me an explanation of kissing me again that night if we're supposed to be broken up, and how it can feel so good when we're together, and that you make it seem like it's the same for you. Your card says the word promise. If you're going to promise me anything, promise me it's not truly over, and that deep down you believe that there's still a chance, that third time's a charm. Maybe it's true that we've rushed things, or that you have rushed things. Maybe our worlds are just too different for now. Maybe you're actually really hurting too because of your divorce or Taylor or her 1-year mark just 3 days before Chase died. When I stop to think about it, it's crazy this is all within a year of each other, and you were just 16 and 17. I feel terrible not realizing Taylor's date. Maybe I was too caught up constantly sitting on a cold, snowy front porch thinking about us and how the fairy tale could possibly be over so soon. Maybe there's still drama with Jesse that you can't, won't, or shouldn't tell me about. Maybe there always will be. I was certainly surprised to have him threaten me at the chairlift of Brinehead, and his strange words about you still being his wife. I could have reacted better in the moment, but that experience was definitely a step up from whatever stalking he's been doing. But really, it doesn't faze me. I will gladly accept the bad with the good and the crazy with the calm, if it means I still have us. Your words and actions have echoed that you know that our relationship is real, Misha. We really did enter a wonderland of our own. You left, but I'll be standing at the gate waiting for you to come back. I already waited a long time once, and I'm willing to wait again. When you do come back, and I believe you will, please wear the red dress.
Oh, there is so much to share. So many things to understand on levels that I didn't feel like I could share with Jake at the time. Sometimes when we tell this story, it's kind of a joke that he dumped me in the 6th grade, and then I dumped him as a senior. And when you hear the gravity of how serious it was and how emotional it was, it's not really a joke. It's so much heavier, this one is. And there is obviously so much more involved than when we were in the 6th grade and his friends convinced him to dump me. It's a little bigger. Okay, so let's get into it. And I guess just to start out by saying there is an element when Jake is delivering this story that suggests that he does understand a little bit more about what I was going through right? When he kind of goes through, well, maybe this and maybe this is happening for you. But at the time, that was really, really hard for him to see. He actually really didn't see a lot of it until later. And even in more depth as we've worked on this project together. So that's kind of an interesting thing to point out. I still think it was great the way that he told the story. But back then he really just felt confused and sad. And no matter how much I tried to tell him or explain like what was happening for me, it was really hard for him to grasp. It was hard. And there were elements that I didn't want to explain. There were elements that I didn't want to say. And I'll tell you what those were and why. And it's really, really tough. So first of all, there is a part of me that is still trying to, figure out my life and the whirlwind and everything that's happening and sort of managing both sides of this coin of things that are going on in my life. There's something that Americans used to do when they moved out of one house and into another in the early 20th century. And it was tradition and part of their culture that they would burn all of their old dishcloths so that none of the bad energy that had been wiped up in the old house would move with them into their new abode. And I guess there's a little bit of a way to say that I was still trying to burn my own dishcloths, right? I was in therapy and that's tricky because it was more of, like group sessions and group therapy, but I was learning how I needed to heal from my old relationship before I could truly attract and have something different. So I knew that, and that was in my mind. And so there were elements of my life where, I've kind of told you the dichotomy of having conversations with Jesse and him starting to date other girls, but playing games with me, playing mind games with me, and him stalking me. And there's so much depth to also just me grieving still, right? My journal on December 26th says, Christmas was okay, but it really didn't seem like Christmas. It's hard to go from family to all alone. It just didn't feel right. And yes, I got, some very thoughtful gifts from my family, which were amazing, and I was surrounded by my parents and my sisters and everything. But there's just a different shift when you move from, being married and being a mom, and the way that you start to learn to think about holidays and things differently, and then shifting that. And so that part is going on. Taylor's 1 year, with her passing was January 19th. And I went skiing with Jesse on that day. And then we had dinner with all of the family. And the only reason I know that is because it's in my journal. I have, like, sitting here right now talking to you, I have no memory of that, which I think is kind of an interesting thing and a whole nother conversation. I also had, Jake mentions the incident with Jesse at Brian Head, and this is something that was huge, but we also learned to laugh at it, and we still laugh at it. But, Jake went skiing, which he did a lot with all of his buddies, and Jesse worked up there, and he was working at the lift as they were all getting on the chairlift, and Jake's friends had all gone up ahead of him. And Jake comes up and he was the last one. And as he's coming up, Jesse has this really stern look on his face and he says, "Are you Jake?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Why?" And he's like, "Well, you better stay away from Misha or I'm going to have to get you." And he's like, "Oh, really? Why is that?" And at this time he's sitting, loading on the ski lift, and the ski lift is starting to come up, and he turns around and is still having this conversation. And he says, "Oh, really? Why is that?" And he says, "Because she's my wife And then Jake says, "Oh, really? Does she know that?" And so it was such a clever and like witty way for him to respond, and kind of making light of like really big stuff that was happening, you know? So there's all of that. There's the whole side with Jesse. And then there's also the things of like, why was I going to St. George? You know, he mentioned that I wrote a note saying I was going to St. George. Remember, I'm going with my dad because he's going through radiation appointments and he has cancer. And so there's that side of the coin that's also kind of taking, you know, an emotional toll. And then I remember, this is back to Jesse. I remember Jake and I were at my friend Trisha's house, and mind you, let me just give you the status of Trisha. She has a little girl. I mean, she had like a deep and intense relationship. Gosh, I'm trying to remember. I don't think they got married, but she has this little girl and she's living alone. And that's who one of my best friends is. So totally different world than Jake's world. And he came over and he was making shrimp cocktails and we were making milkshakes. And I can remember being completely mortified because I called Jake Jesse. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And he was cooler than cool. Like, he was so rad. He was like, it's seriously, it's no problem at all. Like, I totally understand. You've been used to being with this other person for a really long time. He was so cool about it. Right? But that was what was going on. And as a side note, I think it's so funny that just last Saturday we were at the lake and this song came on, you know, Jesse's Girl. And remember, I've changed his name, so his name's not really Jesse, but it was funny because we were sitting there jamming to Jesse's Girl, and I wish I had Jesse's Girl, and Jake was, you know, wake surfing as this song was on, and we were like making eye contact, and he was like pointing at me, and I was like, oh my gosh, I get it, what you're saying. It was so interesting and so funny that like here we are however many years later and he has Jesse's Girl. Just a side note. But as far as just like everything that I was trying to move through, right? Everything that I was trying to wipe up so that I didn't take it with me into the future. Like, it's kind of, a lot of it's still really going on. And so that was one of the main reasons for breaking up with Jake. There's a couple more. So there was something that he said where, you know, I would still like to occasionally get together, stay in touch, and maybe date some more before I leave in the fall. And then coming back 2 years later. So Jake was planning on serving a mission for our church. And when you do that, you essentially leave for 2 years. You don't see each other. You can write letters, but really you're kind of gone. And you're also, you know, preparing yourself to be able to go by keeping strong morals and values that are really hard when you have a serious boyfriend or girlfriend. So there was a little bit of also wisdom in knowing that, you know, things were escalating and it was probably not a good idea for us to be serious for, you know, this whole almost an entire year before he was going to be leaving. And that was kind of a lot that weighed on my mind as well. And I knew that there was wisdom in that. However, the biggest reason in the whole breakup is actually something that I didn't even feel like I could tell Jake at the time. It was really, really hard for me to go on this like balance beam of life, like where I was kind of balancing, okay, what life would be like if I was still a high school senior. And then the kind of conversations that I was having like with my best friends, it was a totally different life. And when I would talk to Jake, it was like I had seen so much life and experienced so much, and yet he was still really unaware of life. And it felt unrelatable to me. It felt like I could not even just imagine sitting with Jake and saying, oh my hell, you're never going to guess what he did yesterday. You know what I mean? Whatever. Like, I couldn't really share who I was and the things that I was experiencing, what I was going through, because he didn't have the capacity to hold that or understand that with his level of maturity at the time, even though we were the same age, right? It's just that I had really experienced a lot. And I feel like it would hurt Jake to have said that to him. I feel like that would have been something that would have like stung, like you're not mature enough, right? But yet, remember what I shared with you in episode 9, that episode is called Premonitions in Your Future. If you remember the experience that I had that was so real, and it was like I knew that my future was Jake. And so even though that was not really at the forefront of my mind, it was still something that was existing there. It was still something that was part of my subconscious mind. And so, I look back and I go, wow, if my son was telling me this, I would say, yeah, she's playing games with you too, right? It's hard to hear about how you apparently already like me so much, but it's scary to keep seeing each other. Like, it felt to me like it was too fast, too serious, too all the things all at once. And it was just too much and it was overwhelming. And he says, it's hard to hear you already say that I'm everything you would want in a future husband, yet we'll go ahead and limit our interactions for now. There was a working, and there was some things that I needed to do to, I guess we talked about kind of clearing out and wiping up, but also a shift or shifts that I needed to make to, I guess, be where Jake existed on that plane spiritually and I guess vibrationally, like clear of drama and things that I was carrying with me that was just a part of my life that had been built in up to that point, right? I think it's really interesting the way that he wanted and needed perspective so badly. But yet he also really did have a hard time shifting into saying, I mean, I know in this episode he says, maybe there's still drama with you and Jesse, and maybe it's too much with Taylor and there's, so much going on. And he says at this circumstance in the episode, he says, I feel terrible for not realizing Taylor's date. Maybe I was too caught up, constantly sitting on a cold, snowy front porch, thinking about us and about how the fairy tale could possibly be over so soon. Right? And so Jake is really, really seeing life from his perspective. There's a cartoon drawing that I came across that I really treasure, and the caption is 2 pictures, and one of them is from one side of the picture and one of them's from another side of the picture. And so what is in the picture is a small island with a tree and a man, and then off in the distance there's a boat and there's a guy in the boat with his hands up. Both of the guys have their hands raised up like they're celebrating. The guy on the land is screaming, "Boat!" And then the picture on the other side is more of like the view, what it would look like if you were in the boat and you were seeing the island and you saw the guy on the island and the guy in the boat is screaming, "Land!" Like they're both so excited to see the other one, thinking that the answer lies in what they're discovering. And it's interesting to me that it's really difficult for us to see the world from anything outside of what our circumstance is, right? And so Jake was experiencing heartache and sadness. And I was like, oh my word, there's so much more than that. There is so much more than that. There's a short story I want to share with you called A Man with a Lamp. It says that once there was a blind man that lived in a small town, and he always carried this lighted lamp with him in his hand whenever he went out at night. And one time there was a group of young travelers, and they came across him, and they were making light and kind of making fun of him and saying, "Hey man, you're blind, you can't see anything. Why do you carry the lamp?" And the blind man replies, "Yes, unfortunately I'm blind and I can't see anything, but I hold a lighted lamp and I carry it for people like you who can see, because you might not see the blind man coming and end up bumping into me, and that's why I carry a lighted lamp." And this group of travelers felt ashamed and apologized for their behavior. And it's interesting how this is a story that helps us see that if we jump into somebody else's shoes, or if we at least try to understand perspective from their side, that, there's so much more to know and understand, right? Before we judge others, or before we think that their side of the coin or their point of view doesn't line up with ours, and how could it not? And maybe they are carrying lamps for our sake, and we don't even know it. That sometimes because of the position that we're in, that we can't understand. And part of us understanding that we don't always have the capacity to understand all the things is a really big part in just trying to understand. It's interesting to me how much Jake understands now. He'll read some of my journal entries, and be baffled that one day I'm dealing with this, and then the next day I'm out on a date with him, and he's just like, "What?" I can't even imagine. And even though, as we got married and as we got more serious with our relationship, he understood that more. He really understands it now more than he ever did before. The Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi said, "You're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view." And for this little snippet in time, I hope that it only can help us as listeners to be able to widen our aperture and to see things from not just our side of the circumstance, right? If we're on the land and we're screaming, "Boat!" and the guy in the boat is screaming, "Land!" Just so excited. I'm sure if the guy in the boat could imagine what that guy is excited about on land, he would probably be able to try to understand that. But at the time, it's just so natural for us to see it from our side of the coin. Stephen Covey says, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it." As we grow older, because experiences teach us, and the more that we experience things, the more that we are apt to stand back and go, "Oh, wow, you know what? That doesn't make sense to me, but I know I don't know the whole story." There's actually a story that Jake's mom told me that when her kids were little, they went to stay at her grandmother's house. And her oldest was upstairs sleeping on the same level as grandma. And then everybody else was downstairs. And I think it was probably just Jake's parents and probably baby Jake, that were downstairs. And all night long, there was like this ruckus upstairs. And Jake's mom, Lynette, was saying like, "Oh my word, like, Grandma, would you just go to bed?" And she just kept thinking, like, does she have to get up and go to the bathroom like 50 times? Why does she have to make so much noise while she's doing it? And can I just get some rest, Grandma? And that was her perspective. That's all she knew. But when she woke up in the morning, she found out that her oldest had been throwing up all night, and that Grandma was up attending to this child of hers, washing sheets, blankets, and Cassie. And upon learning this, her eyes were totally opened, And she felt bad, that she had kept wishing her grandmother to please just go to sleep and be quiet. She turned to like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful. I have such a good grandmother that would care for my kid. And right? We see things differently, and it totally shifts our perspective. Jeffrey Durart said, you have the ability to adjust the lens through which you view the world. There's something called perspective taking. Perspective taking is actively considering other people's points of view, and that this happens when we suspend judgment, when we understand that person's thoughts, motives, and emotions, and trying to picture, like, why do they think and feel the way that they do? So in this sense, perspective taking is a very intentional process rather than something automatic. Because automatic, we are human beings, and we tend to just see the side of life from our perspective, whether we're on the land or whether we're in the boat. And when we make a pointed effort to think about someone else and what things might be going on for them, that's called perspective taking. So there's so much behind this, and I'm sure that you can even see that in your life, that these are things that have, being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes expands when you already have like positive emotion for that person, when you have empathy or compassion, something about that person, right? Like you can always imagine like the kid coming up to the mom and being like, but mom, da da da. And then the mom's like, yeah, but do you know what he's going through? Right? Like we can see the other side of like what they might be going through more intimately when we're connected with them. And also I think the more that things happen, like what happened to Lynette with grandma, right? And being able to then consider later on in life, oh, well, maybe this or maybe that. Maybe you're really bothered with someone to later find out that they're helping you. What you're bothered with, they're helping you or whatever. It completely changes things when we at least try to see things from the other side of the coin. There's an experiment that Gene Padgett did in 1956, and he did this very clever way of setting up different mountains and then being able to set up a doll, and knowing that her viewpoint, she would only be able to see two of the mountains. And the children that he brought in, because what he was trying to do is he was trying to understand at what age could these children differentiate that they could see three of the mountains and the doll could only see two. And so what he decided and what he figured out after lots of experiments with kids of different ages, children up to 4 years old usually said that the doll's perspective on the mountains would match their own. But a 7 or 8-year-old could consistently identify the correct perspective that the doll would have on the mountain scene, that they actually could only see two of the mountains. And since that time, that experiment has been repeated in different ways, finding similar results. But here's what's interesting that has been asked is that maybe the question isn't necessarily saying when does perspective taking, not like when does it start, but when does it stop? Right? Because in our minds, sometimes as adults, we don't automatically try to see somebody else's perspective. And especially teenagers. We have to really help mold their brains and help them like, well, you're probably not seeing the whole picture. Let's look at it. Right? And so how much of our life are we practicing this skill? Because it is a skill. And there are lots of ways that we can approach and help children learn perspective taking. But it's interesting to also then apply it to us and say, well, how can we learn perspective taking? So perspective taking is really helpful when you're parenting a child or helping educate a child. and you're able to talk to them about stories they read and talk to them about different people's perspectives in the story and listening to them describe their thoughts and feelings about things and what they might think that these characters are experiencing. Or maybe we help children learn perspective taking by just asking them about their friends in circumstances like, well, how do you think she feels? Or how do you think, why do you think she feels that way? Or, just different points of view, and trying to really help them be able to see the whole picture. And that's something that really helps children. It forms their brain differently. And we can do it for ourselves too. Sometimes we just forget because we start to get so solidified that our way is the only way. And we do need experiences like grandma upstairs washing all the things and taking care of the child to help us have that reality check, right? But to get there without just having experiences like that, it's really just trying to understand others. Just trying to understand them. Really trying to have compassion for them and see life on the side of the coin that they're living. And once we do that, we can start to understand that it's bigger than just our view. I can remember when I first learned about the Enneagram and I started to get really in depth about the different numbers. And if that's something that you've never done, it's really fun work. It's really fun to dive into and to understand how the people are in your life, different personalities and how they function inside of that. And it gives you such a different perspective. It's incredible. And I really loved learning that because I can then start to grasp how different, they see the same thing that I'm seeing. I learned wildly that when I talk strongly to my mom, she interprets that as yelling because our numbers are so different and the way that we see and experience the world is so different. And so it helped me to be able to hold a different lamp at night with my mom, right? It's a very interesting thing in the ways that we approach. Another thing that I think really helps us to perspective take is to use the word maybe. Just see how many times you can throw the word maybe out with the other person's perspective. Like, well, maybe they were having a bad day, or maybe I need to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they understand things, something, like that word maybe can be magic. It can be magic because all that it does is just help us to introduce the possibility that it's not just the way that we see it. And maybe can be so strong in very good ways. Brene Brown said something interesting, and this is a concept from her. She says, we all see the world through a lens. We look through lenses of age, ethnicity, race, ability, and that's how we see the world. We slide in a lot of other lenses like insight, personal experience, history, family stories, and we all see the world through this unique lens. We tell people that empathy is putting down that lens and picking up the lens of another person, but we can't really put down that lens. That lens, the way that we see the world, right, is soldered to our face. And so she says, if empathy requires perspective taking, how do we take the perspective of other people if the lens that we see the world through is soldered to our face? And you know what she says? She says the answer is that you believe people's stories. You believe people's experiences as they tell them to you. You don't run that through your lens. You truly try to understand that the world they see through their lens is real and honest and as truthful as the world that we see through our lens. And so ultimately, really understanding people, trying to understand, getting and gaining more perspective comes by really diving in with them, listening, asking them questions, and then getting out of the way with the answers that they give. And really, really letting them tell us their experience and not trying to control how they're saying it or what they're saying. Something that is interesting to note is that our brain changes when we do perspective take. Different parts of our brain fire, and studies that were done at Oxford University help us understand that when we perspective take, we have larger and better connected social brain networks, and we actually have more friends. The more you use this skill, the stronger that it gets. And it can also activate networks in our brain that are associated with creative thinking and exploration. There's always a lot of pluses, I find, when we try to do what actually feels really right in the world, and the way that it shapes us into better people. Craig Lounsborough said, "Our agenda is the lens through which we view the world that is in reality a blindfold through which we miss the world." Is a very profound statement. Essentially, the more that we do our very best to remove our preconceived notions or our lenses, the things that are soldered to our face, the more that we really try to understand other people, the more that we remove that blindfold, the more that we help ourselves be able to truly see the situation. And it's interesting if you think about the situation that we're talking about with Jake, understanding, right, like why did I break up with him and what is actually going on? When we do that, we actually relieve a lot of suffering. We relieve a lot of suffering. Our tendency is to sit on that front porch, being caught up thinking about, the relationship between Jake and I. That's what our tendency is. But the truth is that only invites more rumination and more suffering and more hurt. And the more that we try to understand what actually is going on, we can change our thoughts, we can change our perspective. And maybe sometimes the perspective look we really need is not about seeing others' points of view, but about changing our own thoughts. Being able to accept that whatever is ready for us and the timing of the way our life will happen, and being able to move into trust, because that brings about a totally different vibration in which we can attract really amazing and beautiful things, and completely stepping into allowing opens up the world for so much more than when we sit on that snowy front porch. I hope that you can see that by opening our perspective and trying to understand other people, that it truly helps us to come into a space where we have more power than we think we do. Thank you so much for listening today. Hope you loved it. A reminder to rate and review and subscribe to the podcast. Also, another reminder that you can support this podcast by using our affiliate link on Amazon, which is typing in the same Amazon.com, but then using a /shop/my friend Misha. And nothing costs you more to purchase, but it gives us a little bit of a kickback. And that helps the podcast to continue to move forward and in the direction that, holy cow, I'm so excited for. I have so many really incredible plans for the future. I know that I've said a few of them to you, and they're coming. It just takes a little bit of time. So thank you so much for sticking with us and listening to the stories every single week. There is more coming to support your heart, right? With the heart coherence and really diving in. I'm excited to do an entire course around learning heart coherence this fall and starting a meditation app. It's really going to be some fun and amazing work that I'm excited to bring to you. As I leave you today, I want to remind you of one of the quotes that we said in the podcast, and it's by Stephen Covey. It says, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we are conditioned to see it." And just a reminder that the more that we can try to put that down so that we can see other people and love other people, even knowing that we can't completely put it down, but that trying makes life better. It makes us better people. It shapes our brain differently. And man, it really helps other people in our life feel seen and heard. Thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time, my friend.